already had 6 hours of kelp in the last few weeks. So the fact that she's got the stamina to come back again is quite impressive. So yeah, I'm going to hopefully talk for about 30-40 minutes about UK kelp forests and introduce you to what is, well, I would argue, the best marine habitat we have in the UK, if not the world. So many of you have probably heard of kelp forests, and the image that you might have is of these giant kelp forests and this lovely little marine otter curled up in it, maybe holding hands with another little marine otter. And this is an image from Monterey Bay, California, and that's probably what you think when you think about kelp forests. You may not think about what we have around the country here. So this is an image of a kelp forest off Hoy in Orkney. So the dive is called Nipple Rock. It's a rock that sits in about 12 metres of water, goes down to 50 metres. And what we can see is a huge amount of diversity. So you've got this kelp forest here, you've got soft corals, you've got other algae in the top left-hand corner. Is you've got a whole load of safe swimming around that wouldn't be there if that kelp forest wasn't there. This is an image from Shetland, and these are hugely dynamic environments, so they're often on very wave-exposed coastlines. You can see that water motion over them, so they have to be really resilient to the environmental stresses they're exposed to. And kelp are the sort of underwater forests that you would see. So they're equivalent to a broadleaf forest on land. They offer many of the same functions and support the same ecosystem services. So what are they? In essence, in science we quite like to have quite strict definitions for many things, but then we get a little bit loose in others. So kelp is often used as a catch-all phrase for any large brown canopy-forming species. So there's a range of different species in there, but the true kelps are the order Laminarialis. They have a biphasic life cycle, so they have a microscopic gametophyte stage, and that's their diploid stage, and then they go into a macroscopic sporophyte stage, which is what you can see here, which is a haploid stage. Generally, you can find kelp forests around the globe. In fact, it's estimated that about 33% of global coastlines are covered by kelp forest. You find them on rocky substrates, and what we can see with this map here is that they're pretty much restricted to sort of temperate and subpolar environments. You can see some extensions along the coast of Chile and Peru, along the African coastline and the Spanish coastline, and that's because there's cold water upwelling in these regions, which means that you've got this cold, nutrient-rich water that's brought to the top that allows these species to exist further north than you would expect. In fact, while my focus is mainly on UK kelp forests, there's a really cool kelp in Peru called Asenia cockeri, and that lives about 5 degrees south of the equator, which is pretty unheard of for a cold water species. And I'm not really that interested in kelp as a sort of plant. I know very little about biology. I'm very much an ecologist. I'm interested in the interactions between different organisms. But what I really love about kelp is what they do as a habitat. So they're hugely productive, okay? They're really, really good at taking carbon dioxide from the water and converting that into biomass. And that biomass is consumed by a relatively few species. So what we've got up there, we've got the blue-rayed limpet, my second favourite limpet. It's Patella pellucida. It's really pretty. It's only very tiny. If you go down to the low shore, you'll find it grazing on the kelp, either on the stipes, the sort of trunk, or on the blades. So some of it is consumed by organisms in situ as live material, but the vast majority of it is actually consumed as detritus, so as dead material. And so this material is either consumed in the kelp forest, or here we've got my dog Sphagnum acting as scale. He was named for a very long time, but no one else is calling Sphagnum in the park. But this is a picture along the Northumberland coastline, and so this is a huge amount of kelp that's been washed ashore after a storm. We had an MSc student a few years ago who actually looked at the importance of this this beach cast rack for overwintering birds, and because in amongst all this there's loads of amphipods and other little gribblers, is that they're an important environment for birds to actually feed on during the winter months. But not only does it land on beaches, it's washed out to sea where it's consumed by a wide range of organisms as well. And so, as I've said, some of this kelp production is consumed by grazers. So we've got Patella pellucida, the blue-rayed linglet, another of my favourite little mollusk, Lacuna vincta, which is really, really tiny and grazers on it. In many parts of the world, and some of you may have even heard about this, in fact there's a great, is the cartoon called Octonauts or something like that? Where's the young, yeah, there's a really good Octonauts episode where they actually talk about how the otters have to eat more urchins to stop the urchins overgrazing the kelp forest. So overgrazing by urchins is actually quite an important process in many parts of the world, and it can actually be quite destructive. Less of a problem in the UK, although there's a bit of evidence for some impacts of elevated urchin numbers around the northeast coastline. So we've got a PhD student looking at that at the moment. So most of the productivity enters detrital systems, and so we've got kelp forests here. So about 80% of the primary productivity that goes into biomass is lost into the system. And some of that is consumed by a suite of grazers and detritivores. Others of that is exported. Sphagnum this is sphagnum's second and last appearance. Again, more kelp washed on the soil. Some of it is exported to other habitats. And when we have food exported to other habitats, we call that a spatial subsidy. So this highly productive environment casting it out to less productive environments. And it can move along a coast, it can be taken out to sea, it can go in offshore transport into submarine canyons. And indeed, more recently there's been increasing interest in the role that kelp forests may play in being exported to offshore sediments, where it can be stored for long-term, so greater than 100 years or more, and then that becomes part of perhaps climate change mitigation in terms of carbon sequestration. So this is a fish box. This is taken, that's all kelp in that fish box, and that's taken from about 200 metres off the west coast of Scotland and a couple of 100 kilometres out to sea. So there's evidence that you can find kelp fragments thousands of metres below the sea and hundreds of kilometres away from the nearest kelp forest. So this stuff persists and is transported where it can be consumed by other organisms or sequestered away and aiding in climate change mitigation. They also support really high levels of biodiversity. So in this image here, we've got some dead man's fingers, so some soft corals, some beautiful red algae. We've got some jewel anemones over here. We've got some bryozoans there. And then in amongst all of that, you've got a really high diversity of invertebrates that are then food for other organisms. So because kelp creates this three-dimensional environment, they're about 3 metres to 4 metres high, is that they create a habitat and alter the environment, which leads, I've just done 8,500 steps, my watch has just told me. Just in the 5 minutes I've been speaking so far. They create habitat and alters the environmental conditions, and what this leads to is this rich understory algal assemblages. So these are all red algae on the floor there. They support really high diversity faunal assemblages. And we'll look at this in a bit more, but they create a home, they're a holdfast, their root has lots of intricate homes that organisms live in. The species up here has algae that grows as epiphytes, and that is colonised by a whole wide range of invertebrates as well. And so they also support species of ecological importance, such as sea urchins, and also economic importance, such as crabs and lobsters. And they create habitat for fish, including nursery habitat for commercially important species, and I'll show you an image in a second of really high density cod in amongst kelp forests. And of course these attract higher order predators, including otters, seals and seabirds. I don't know, how many of you watched the David Attenborough Wild Isles? You know, the one that was based around the UK? A lot of you, yeah, I knew this was the audience. I don't know about you, but I don't know if you remember the first scene. The first scene was an orca chasing a seal. Do you remember that scene? So you were watching the orca chase the seal, I imagine. I was looking at the kelp forest the seal was hiding in amongst, and I was like, yes, kelp's really important. Even David agrees with me. And kelp forests are comparable to coral reefs in terms of their ecological and economic importance. Indeed, it's estimated that the goods and services produced by kelp forests are valued about $33 billion a year. So if we lost these kelp forests, we'd lose all of these ecosystem services. Kelp is generally separated into three sort of habitats or structures. So they have a holdfast, which is much like the root structure, okay? So that is what all kelp grows on bedrock. So this attaches to the bedrock. And what they have is each of these individual structures coming out of here are called haptra, and haptra collectively create the holdfast. And in amongst those, there's lots of little chambers and nooks, and food gets stuck in them. And so they support really high diversity of fauna. It's estimated that between 30 to 70 different species can be found within a kelp holdfast, with up to 90 species found. And it's a whole wide range. So we've got some crustaceans here, some echinoderms, so brittle stars, baby sea urchins. Sometimes you even find little fish inside there. We probably didn't take a photo of that because we probably didn't have ethics for it. And then often it's greater than 10,000 individuals may be found in each of these. But as you can imagine from here, these are different species, and you can see they have quite different holdfasts. So this is the giant kelp Macrocystus pyrifera, so it's got a huge amount of area. This is Dovilia antarctica, which is a species that you find on the New Zealand coastline, on really, really wave-exposed coastline. So actually, it almost grows flat on the rocks so that things can't live in that. You then have what's called the stipe, which would be equivalent to the trunk in a terrestrial plant or tree. And this is a rigid structure that holds the blade into the water column. And this can vary from a couple of centimetres up to 30 metres or more in something like the giant kelp Macrocystus or the bull kelp Nereocystus. And what we can see on some species is, so this species here is Laminaria hyperborea. That's the species that we have around much of our coastline. It's the dominant kelp species in the northeast Atlantic. And it's got little grooves and dimples in it that actually creates a really nice area for epiphytic algae to colonise the stipes. So where you've got this epiphytic algae, that provides food and habitat for a wide range of organisms as well. But then you've got some species like Macrocystus that they don't have any epiphytes on them, so they don't support high levels of diversity. But where you do have these epiphytic communities, they can support diverse animal and plant communities, up to about 80 species. And in one individual of Laminaria hyperborea in Norway, they found 55,000 individuals. That's a lot of counting. More counting than Mike did of Hydrobia, based on a waiver project that he was assisting on. The lamina, or the blade, has a large surface area for photosynthesis. And generally this supports the least diversity, but you might find things like blue-rayed limpets, rhizoans, and epiflora on them. So they are really diverse habitats, but they also provide a range of goods as well. So here we know that where you've got kelp forest, you've got a higher abundance of lobsters and crabs. If you look at creels being set along the coastline, quite often they're following the kelp forest along that. This is an image from a Norwegian kelp forest, so the same species that we have. These are all juvenile cod, and for scale there's a diver in the background there. So they can support really high numbers of different organisms. And they can also provide a range of other ecosystem services. So this is an image of a kelp forest at Warburth in Orkney. It was exceptionally low tide. This species would not normally be exposed to the air. I think it was a -0.5 or something like that. I've never seen the tide lower. But these create three-dimensional structure. They then also, because of that, they create friction. So as wave energy comes in, they hit that sort of bed friction, and that slows down the wave energy and provides coastal protection for our coastal environment. Indeed, we've got a project that we've currently got 4 PhD students working on called Stronger Shores. Some of you might have heard of that, run out of South Tyneside Council. And one of our students has just come back from using the wave tanks at Bangor University in North Wales. And it shows really nicely that when you've got high density kelp forests, you've got a real reduction in the wave energy that hits our coastline. So a real nature-based solution for perhaps increased storminess under future climate change. And then also, we know the Farne Islands, if any of you are divers, if any of you go up to the Farne Islands for a dive, they'll throw you into a kelp forest at least once during that dive, because then seals come and play with you and bite your nose and try and steal your fins. And so our kelp forests support a lot of enigmatic species that brings tourism to there as well, and orcas. There's also some thought that the colonisation of the Americas was facilitated by kelp forests. So there's increasing evidence that the maritime route down from the west coast of the United States into South America is all fringed by kelp forests, and it was thought that that would facilitate migration because there was plenty of food for people to eat adjacent to those systems, so facilitated that migration about 14,000 years before present. So I hope in saying what I've said that you feel a certain amount of passion for the importance of kelp forests, but if you don't find me very convincing, perhaps you will be convinced by this naturalist. So this is based on Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, and this was when he was going around the South American coastline. And he stated in his journal that the number of living creatures of all orders whose existence intimately depends on kelp is wonderful. A great volume may be written about them. I can only compare these great aquatic forests of the southern hemisphere with the terrestrial ones in the intertropical regions, so equivalent to the Amazon. Yet if in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as here from the destruction of kelp. So Darwin thought that kelp was quite important, not just Pip. But if Darwin isn't your favourite person, perhaps you feel that David Attenborough is the person to listen to on this. And in 2018, he was interviewed for a Times article about a fisheries bylaw that was coming into place in Sussex, and part of that bylaw was to stop trawling in a bid to have recovery of the kelp forest along that. And he said kelp forests not only form an important part of the food chain, but act as vital habitat for a wide array of species. Look closely and you will find a range of fascinating sea life, from invertebrates such as sea stars and anemones and limpets to mammals such as sea otters. Many of the fish species, such as cod, that are so important to us economically and culturally, are also found here. For these reasons, and many more, carbon storage just being one, it is absolutely imperative that we protect our kelp forests. I'm sure many of you may have seen his latest movie, Ocean, and there was an accompanying book with that, of which there is a chapter in there on kelp forests. And actually, the result of this book, I impressed my father for the first time ever in my life, because I provided a small amount of advice for this kelp forest chapter, and I have now got David Attenborough's signature. I have done many things in my life, but I cannot tell you how excited my father is about this. I have finally become the child that he always wanted to be. I find it utterly depressing. Anyway, moving back to the UK, we've got some numbers here. So Laminaria hyperborea, which is our most dominant kelp, covers it's thought to occupy about 2,500 square kilometres. This is the species you find on all but the most wave-exposed coastline. And more sheltered shores, we have Saccharina latissima. The sugar kelp, it's also the kelp that we most often grow in terms of aquaculture. And it's estimated that in total of all the 6 kelp species, it's estimated that they occupy about 5,700 square kilometres and about 11 million metric tonnes of fresh weight. But those numbers don't really mean anything, do they? They're just numbers to bandy around. Before I go on to the next slide, what you've got is the bubbles indicate the sort of abundance. So we can see that the greatest abundances of kelp forests on the west coast of Scotland, which are very exposed. But also actually the north and east is quite important. And in fact this model is a model, and models are always wrong. I think Aileen's in the audience and she knows that full well, is that actually it underrepresents kelp forests in the northeast. And I think that's primarily because we've got a lot of sort of offshore reefs in amongst sand. And that's why we see such high densities washed ashore. But these numbers don't really mean very much, but let's put it into comparison with other marine vegetated habitats. So our kelp forests, we've got 13 times more kelp than we do salt marsh, and 67 times more kelp than we've got seagrass meadows. So from a UK perspective, kelp forests are our largest marine vegetated habitat. And we have 6 species of true kelp and 1 species of pseudo-kelp. So this is Saccharisa polychides. One of these species is an introduced species, Unteria penitivita. You may know it better as wakame. It's used for your sushi, for your California rolls and things like that. It first entered the country, I think, in 1934. It is reached the Firth of Forth to the north and Hull to the south. And I'm waiting for it to get to Newcastle so we can do some research on it. But it hasn't actually arrived here yet. What we've got here is we've got a range of different species. This is Laminaria hyperborea, our most dominant species. It lives for about 18 years. You can actually cut the stipe, take a section of that, you can hold it up to the sky, and because it has a seasonal growth cycle, you can age the kelp like you would age a tree. So they can live a long time. But what we can see here is the blue arrows pointing down, as these are cold water species. So we expect a number of these species to decrease with climate warming, and we expect others to increase. So the invasive species to increase. This is more of a warm water kelp species, and then Laminaria ochroluca, which we only found in the southwest at the moment, is likely to increase. And these, while they're all kelp, they are actually quite different in terms of the amount of epiphytes they contain, for instance. So functionally, it could be quite different as climate changes. And actually, in the UK, we're pretty lucky. We're in the sort of honeypot, or the actual best spot, and seeing very little changes in our kelp forest ecosystems. But they are subject to a really wide range of stresses around the globe. So the green lines on these maps show the distribution of kelp. The light green shows the anticipated distribution with climate warming as the ice cover disappears from around the poles. And we can see that a range of different things are impacting them. So decadal scale warming, marine heat waves and storminess are all linked to climate change. You've also then got increased epiphytes, pollution, eutrophication, invasive species, and also wild harvesting of these are all leading to decreases across the world. But as I said, we're pretty lucky here in the UK in our system. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But this is my close collaborator, Dan Smale. He's based down at the Marine Biological Association. And we first met in Western Australia doing postdocs together. And then we ended up both back in the UK. I was in mid Wales at the time, and he was down in Plymouth. And we decided that we sort of quite liked each other. We quite liked going to the pub. We quite liked collecting data. And so we got together in the first year we were back in the UK and decided, what are we going to actually do some work on? Let's write some grants together. So our first paper we wrote on UK kelp forest was in 2013, where we made the point that actually kelp forest research had really not seen a lot of effort in the UK. We can see that in, this is the total number of papers written over a 15-year period, I think it was, and you can see that Australia and the United States are far out in front, and you can see that the UK is quite lowly at the end there. Now, in part, going back further, is that the UK used to be an absolute world leader in understanding kelp biology and ecology, Mary Parks at the MBA in the 1940s, Joanna Kane in the 1960s in the Isle of Man were really real pioneers in understanding the biology and the ecology of kelp forests. But during the 1970s and the 1980s, research really decreased in the UK, in part because it became legislatively really difficult to undertake research using scuba diving equipment. So we came back, we found our niche, and then we decided that we were interested in kelp forests, we were also interested in climate change. So we decided to create a spatial gradient. Dan's based down in Plymouth, so at D. I was based in Aberystwyth, so the nearest nicest diving is Pembrokeshire. So that chose two of the sites. And then we wanted some northern sites where the temperature was cooler. So we've got a mate in Oban, Mike Burrows, so we decided we'd have a site in Oban. And then we felt that we'd quite like to go across to Orkney because it sounded like it was good diving. So that's how we came up with our experimental design. These places quite nicely is that there's about a 2.5 degree difference in temperature between the north of Scotland and southwest Wales and southwest Plymouth, which ideally is also how we predict seawater temperatures to change. So this was a space for time type approach. So if Scotland was more likely to get like the southwest with warming, so if there were differences in the structure of those kelp forests, we could provide some level of prediction how those kelp forests might change through time. So as a function of this, we did an awful lot of field work. At one point in time, 1 year, we spent more time together than we did with our respective partners. It was quite worrying. We spent over 300 hours underwater. We collected water samples, we tagged loads of plants, we tagged thousands of plants to look for dislodgement. We did a huge disturbance experiment where we cleared 3-metre diameter areas to look at the recovery from disturbance. Dan looks like he's 12 there, he's aged considerably over that time. We also did a 500 unique beer challenge 1 year where we had to try and drink 500 unique beers through the year, which is actually really difficult. But we kept a log of what we did. We should have really taken bloods before and after. We didn't do that, but it did work out that I had consumed 31 days of my recommended calorific intake was in unique beer, which is a little bit worrying. Anyway, we collected loads and loads of data. I'm not going to show you all of this data because it turns out it's too much, but what I do want to do is that we've now got over 10 years worth of data for this system. So we've looked over that 10 years at the density of kelp forest, their percent cover, and their standing stock. And so what we've got is 2 sites in the west of Scotland, 2 sites in the southwest of England, just to show quite nicely here. And what we can see is that actually there's pretty much over that 10 years similar densities and percent cover across regions. So these systems are pretty stable, even though that we're going through quite a lot of change in terms of climate warming. We can see that in one of the sites in Western Scotland there's a higher standing stock, but it's again fairly constant through time, and that is actually a really exposed site. And we can actually go further back in time. So we've got Duart Castle up here, so that's the density comparing 1980 to 2022, and stipe length, and 40 years apart there's no significant difference in the density or stipe length. We can see that again, these are at 4 different locations around the Oban area. So data collected between 1969 and 73 in Arsay, 70 to 76 in Cuin Sound, and I don't think I'm going to be able to say that, 1970 to 1976, and then what we've collected more recently, and again there's no real difference. But if we actually go down to the southwest, so this is Wembury just outside of Plymouth, and data on density collected in the 1940s and the 2010s, and standing stock in the 1940s and the 2010s, as you can see there's been a significant reduction in southwest Britain, which is our warmest part of the country. And what we're seeing is loss of laminaria hyperborea, which has been replaced by this pseudo-kelp that only lives for 18 months compared to the 18 years of laminaria hyperborea. And so it's now coming to take over in those locations. So it's highly likely that this decrease we're seeing in the southwest is because temperatures are warming, and now in the summer the sea surface temperatures regularly reach above the optimal conditions for laminaria hyperborea. In contrast, in this part of the world, they're still in the sort of perfect conditions. And I want to just quickly finish off on actually looking at some of the resilience of our kelp forests by using a northeast example. So these blue dots on the figure on the left, those are all coal mines around the region, and of course coal was the primary source of electricity generation in the 1970s, and the Northumberland and Durham coalfields were some of the most productive in the country. But the waste material that you got from these was a challenge to dispose of. And so what people did is they looked to the sea. So some of you may be familiar with this image. This is an image from Easington Beach. Some of the older people in the audience may actually remember this movie, Get Carter, which Michael Caine starred in and was filmed down there. So this is an image taken from that. So this is all coal waste that they dumped on here. You can see the conveyor belt coming from the pit head, dumping that onto the sea. There's some really lovely images about to come up. So this is, it's not just coal waste, some of it was liquid full of heavy metals, and God knows what. This is my favourite photo of the family picnicking on the coal-covered beach. So they've got their little picnic. I'm guessing they're using coal from just around them to barbecue their snags. And then you've got the sort of trolley bringing down the coal down to the shore. And so this practice of dumping coal waste onto the shoreline continued for about 100 years. And at first it was estimated that natural coastal erosion would be greater than the rate of spoil tipping, and therefore this material would be just washed out to sea, and we wouldn't see it anymore, and therefore it was gone and it wasn't doing anything. But post-war there was an increase in demand for coal and therefore an increase in exploitation. And it was estimated that perhaps 4 million tonnes of coal waste was deposited before licensing occurred. And of course, it's not just the dumping of this material that smothers things, but there was a huge amount of pollutants introduced into the marine environment. So things like chromium, copper, nickel, aluminium, arsenic, lead, and mercury all were deposited into the marine environment. There was progradation of the shoreline, so where the shoreline is now, it was actually 100 metres further out to sea because of all this dumping of waste that essentially reclaimed the land. And this led to a smothering of marine and coastal habitats. And we think that this problem may have disappeared, but to the present day, mine dewatering is still releasing about 16 million litres per day. In fact, you can go on Google Earth and you can see some of the water coming out as discoloration and bubbles into the water. So the impact on the marine environment was that it was estimated there was a 48% reduction in fauna and flora. It was estimated that about 2 invertebrates were found at each shore height. And some work showed that there were shifts in holdfast-associated communities, and this was linked to the increased turbidity in the environment, less water clarity. But actually the main effects were probably not captured because many studies simply couldn't sample at the sites of tipping and had to sample at adjacent areas. And indeed, many of these sites were under several metres of spoil with the rocky shores completely covered. So some of you might be familiar with this project. This was the Turning the Tides project that ran between 1997 and 2003. And they removed about 1.3 million tonnes of waste from the Durham coast. And actually now, this is Easington with all of that coal waste on there. This is Easington today where you can see actually it looks pretty good. And that coastline is now designated as a SSSI, an SPA and a Ramsar site. So they're seeing some recovery of other things. There's also some small-scale efforts taking place in Northumberland in the current time to clean up from coal waste there around Linemouth. So when I first came to Newcastle University in 2020, and it was obviously locked down there, so a year or so later, we've been speaking to people from Durham Heritage coastline, and they wanted us to go and restore kelp in this environment. And I was like, yeah, cool, yeah, I want to restore kelp here. So we went down to the coast, pretty much the first time that we could get out there, and we found that actually we didn't need to restore kelp because kelp had naturally come back itself. So I had a PhD student who was all fired up to go and do a whole load of kelp restoration that now suddenly didn't need to take place. So instead we then set around to looking at the impact of whether that recovery was the same to places that hadn't been impacted before. So we chose some sites. So we had impacted sites around Easington and Blast Beach, impacted sites around New Biggin and Linemouth, and then we had Cullercoats and Brown Bay as unimpacted sites that had never had industrial waste disposed on them. We looked at kelp forest structure. So what we've got here is canopy biomass, density, and age. And I think the important thing to take from this is that while there's variability between sites, so small spatial scales, there's no impact of pollution on there. So you're not seeing older individuals in those yellow unpolluted sites or higher densities of individuals in those yellow unpolluted sites. So there's a small scale variability driven by things like probably different currents and exposure and things like that. But otherwise, essentially, in terms of the structure of the kelp forest, it's exactly the same as these undisturbed sites. And in fact, if you look at carbon standing stock, the values here are very similar to what you would find on the Farne Islands, which you would think of as more of a pristine environment. And we looked at this again, looking at holdfast and stipe-associated fauna. Again, high variability over small spatial scales. There was an increase in species richness in the unpolluted sites, but not in terms of abundance. And when we looked at stipe-associated fauna, again, there was no effect of pollution. This is a figure that some of you may never have had to interpret before, but these are called multi-dimensional scaling plots. They're really easy to interpret, okay? Dots that are nearer to each other have communities that are more similar to each other than dots that are further away, okay? And what we've got is the yellow, which is the unimpacted site, and the green, which are the ones that have been impacted by coal waste. And so we can see, just in a simple picture, that there is separation, okay? But actually, when we do the analysis on that, there's no effect of pollution driving that. It's actually that holdfast, so the house available for organisms to settle in, is much then larger in this unimpacted site. We have no idea why they might be larger. There's some research on macrocystis suggesting that holdfast size might be reduced in response to exposure to heavy metals, but we need to do those experiments ourselves to check here. So there's a greater holdfast volume in non-polluted sites. So just to finish up, with this story here, kelp forest structure, density, biomass and age, the same as non-impacted sites. So the recovery of these kelp forests are fully recovered compared to non-impacted systems. There's no effect of pollution on stipe-associated assemblages, and some effects of pollution for holdfast-associated invertebrates, but that's driven by the size of the holdfasts, rather than direct pollution itself. So I go to lots of conferences where there's a whole load of kelp forest ecologists, and actually a lot of those meetings are about doom and gloom, about how kelp forests are disappearing around our globe because of a range of these stresses. But I think what's really nice about this example is that we know that there was no kelp on these coastlines. It was covered in spoil. But 20 years post-clear-up, this kelp forest has mostly recovered naturally. And I think that's really important when we're talking more and more about restoration of our natural habitats. And restoration costs a lot of money and is difficult to do. We would be much better at conserving our sites and where we have had losses to facilitate their natural recovery by removing the stressors that were once there. And I think this northeast example is a really great example of where you've got natural recovery, where you do get rid of that stressor. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening, and I'll take some questions.